Welcome back to Black Music Scene. I'm your host, David Norville, and we're so glad to have you here. Joining me today are two members of the Black Orchestral Network Steering Committee, here to break down Bonn's newest open letter, Dear American Orchestras III. My guests are Emilio Carlo, violist and Bonn's Director of Projects, and Dr. Lexi Ligon Holloway, cultural anthropologist, professor, and Bonn Steering Committee member. So, Bonn just released its third major call to action. This one focused on diversity fellowship programs, the temporary positions orchestras have used for decades as their primary answer to the question of racial inclusion. The letter documents what Black musicians actually experienced inside those programs and lays out a concrete model for what needs to replace them. In this conversation, we're going to talk about fellowship programs, what they promised, what they delivered, versus the difference between access and investment. What's really going to move the needle to turn this 2-year revolving door into an actual career pathway? So without further ado, Emilio, Lexi, before we get into the letter, let's start here. Really, in your own words, what is the fellowship problem that DAO3 is trying to address? How does that land for you? What do you think the overarching sort of issue is here?
Well, first, I want to start with this letter isn't necessarily a suggestion that we need to replace these diversity fellowships with something. Rather, they need to be revamped or revisited and looked at through a different lens. But I think some of the key things that stick out to me when presenting this, through Bond is that there are just far too many fellowships and not enough retention. And especially when we compare these diversity fellowships to orchestral fellowships over in Europe, some European orchestras, not to name specifics, but on their websites, they'll have that, they proudly boast about 20% of the tenured musicians in their ensembles came from their own orchestral academy or fellowship. The names are interchangeable. Um, and then beyond that, just the benefits that fellows receive, and even that word, it's so strange. I just want to call them musicians, or people, musicians, people,
Right.
individuals, human
Yeah.
beings. They're not just fellows. Um, the benefits that they receive during their time in these programs, it varies widely from access to time on stage, whether it's about their specific instrumentation, or down to how much they're compensated. Look, I did it again. Some musicians reported that they barely got any access to perform with the orchestra because of their instrumentation, and there wasn't necessarily a protocol to allow for them to be rotated into the normal way that the section functions. So it's about access to meaningful experience on stage, receiving ample compensation so that they don't have to worry about maybe picking up a second job, which takes away from the program altogether. And the highlight of the letter for me specifically is that there's just not enough musicians being retained and being given a path towards permanent positions in these ensembles. And yeah, Bonn and many others outside of Bonn see that as a big problem that needs to be revisited.
Definitely. There's a lot there to sit with. But first, I want to hear from Lexi. Anything you'd like to add and contribute to what Emilio just shared?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially hearing about this, the big issue is that the fellowships are not doing the fellowship thing. Um, so when we first started working on DAO3, I was actually a fellow myself in academia. So it was disturbing and fascinating and troubling and somewhat unsurprising to hear the ways that these programs are failing their musicians. The fact that folks are expecting mentorship, expecting these fabulous performance opportunities, expecting to build meaningful relationships with colleagues, and hopefully have some sort of opportunity for further employment. And sounds like none of that is being realized in many of these different positions. Um, so it's a shame. It's also very much parallels what's happening in many other industries. But the level at which they're really being actively devalued, um, and how that's impacting their careers, I think is a bit different. So myself, like, I have folks who took me under their wing, and I have a full salary, which should not be, the shocking thing. I have benefits, I have health insurance, so these are just basic things that you would expect that these fellowship opportunities would offer, but these musicians are not getting that. So again, as Emilio pointed out, like, people are having to take up second, third, fourth jobs. They're not getting to actually perform with the orchestra. Just these basic things that you think would be integrated into a fellowship program are not. So that's sort of what we're thinking about. And then it's obviously, how does this specifically impact Black performing musicians?
Yes. It sounds so lonely for something that needs to be steeped in fellowship. It sounds inconsistent. It sounds isolating. Um, I want to bring those who haven't had a moment to sit with the letter up to speed and allow me to walk through what the letter actually found for anyone who hasn't read it. So, Lexi, as you mentioned, BON interviewed Black musicians who had been through diversity fellowship programs across the country. And, what we found wasn't a set of isolated bad experiences. Of course, it was a consistent pattern. Onboarding, minimal, non-existent, mentorship, inconsistent or absent. Some orchestras, tied pay to performance time, but fellows couldn't actually obtain that time. Sometimes they couldn't even plan to really make space for that time. In one case, a fellow performed less than an hour on stage in an entire year. And almost universally, fellows described feeling marginalized, tokenized, invisible, all the things that you might expect from, the exclusionary practice and culture that comes along with classical music. There's a quote that I wanted to read that comes from the letter, and it's an anonymous quote. I'll read it directly. Constantly worrying about health insurance costs while making less than half of what the people around me were making was a stress I didn't sign up for. My section treated me like a student, talking down to me during lessons and in rehearsals. That less than mentality has followed me to my current position, and it's something I'm working through daily. Phew. And that was a pattern that, was found across orchestras. Some of the context that I think matters, that we talk about frequently, but I think can talk about some more. The 2016 study about 40 years of fellowship programs. In 2016, the League of American Orchestras published a study of 40 years of fellowship programs, and it found the same things Black Orchestral Network found. Programs rarely led to permanent hires. Mentorship wasn't there. Um, but now our interviews 9 years later finds that nothing or maybe very little has changed. I don't mean to ask the obvious, but Emilio, Lexi, how are you responding to this? How were you responding to this in real time while we were doing the research? And is this letter capturing what you know to be true? Is it leaving? Is it finding a more neutral ground? Is it soft pedaling? Is it too aggressive? How is this landing for you, and how are you responding to this?
Yeah, I would say that, having participated in two diversity fellowships when I was obviously a student, transitioning into now with my professional career, referring back to the 40 years of fellowship study in relation to our work here with DAO3, it was an unfortunate remembrance of, oh yeah, I remember seeing this when, because I was part of the inaugural class of the Cincinnati Symphony Diversity Fellowship Program. And I remember when they announced my cohort in that fellowship program, that they put in that percentage. I think it's about like what is it, 2.1, something like that, of orchestral musicians are Black or Latino, stuff like that. Um, and that was the first time that I got a sense of how the odds were like astronomically stacked against me. Um, with all the work that we do in Bonn in my professional career, um, because I'm always engulfed in things about my community and fighting for my community, um, to see those things on paper as a percentage, it unfortunately does something not so healthy to my emotions.
Certainly.
You know what I mean?
Definitely.
It's an unfortunate reminder, like I said.
Yeah. It's painful. And it is a process of bearing witness, which is what this platform, particularly Black Music Scene, is all about. Speaking truth to power, commiserating, right? Finding that healing, and also being truthfully critical about what's happening and how we're going to put a stop to it, right? Or at the very least, change things significantly. Lexi, I want to go to you now. And I would love for you to bring the wonderful research analysis, the sort of backdrop of context that you have. I mean, your research goes beyond documenting what happens to Black classical musicians in these spaces. It examines why it keeps happening. And so I would love to sit there now. I'm wondering, what are some of the things that go into how Black classical musicians or these spaces are structured in a way that treat Black classical musicians as out of place, as unwelcome, as structurally, markedly different. I'm wondering if you could speak to, what does that look like inside of a fellowship program, and talk a little bit about some of the elements that we've uncovered through this process.
Absolutely. There's an amazing American Studies professor named Kianga Yamada Taylor, and she has this great little tiny article. It's she made it for her students when they were going back home to Thanksgiving, and dealing with some family members or cousins or aunties or whoever who will say things like, "Why are you taking a Black Studies course? Not everything's about race. Why you make everything about race?" And she says, thinking about the founding of this country, the incredible anti-Black and anti-Indigenous violence that formed what this state is, how can you think that racism doesn't structure everything? So that's my sort of baseline for this research is anti-Black racism essentially structures all of American life. So when you think about it that way, then what's happening in these orchestras makes a lot more sense. Um, the consistent devaluing of Black people, Black bodies, artistry, intellect runs rampant. The American Orchestra is also caught up with these issues of class and elitism. Classical music used to be this popular, it's popular thing. You would go to the pub, you would hang out with your homies, you would listen to some Bach or some Mozart or whoever, and then you'd go home and it was chill. And then because of, again, the proliferation of anti-Black racism, specifically during the Jim Crow era, with de jure segregation, with this like really intense violence that amped up after emancipation, and then also wanting to distance yourself. Folks who were immigrants, folks who were white, folks who were Asian, whoever, wanting to distance yourselves from Blackness because of how it has been positioned structurally. That's when actually classical music ascended into this elite sphere. And, you can sort of think about that as also an anti-Black sphere. So that's sort of how I've been thinking about it. In regards to the letter, I'm a fiery person. When I hear Emilio's experiences, I get hot. Like when I hear about like, people having um these really horrible moments where they just want to create art. Like that's it at the end of the day. That's what it should be. They want to create art. But how can you do that when you're so worried about how am I going to cover an injury because I don't have insurance? Or how can I feel comfortable on this stage when I've only been here for 45 minutes, So I actually think the letter is quite generous. Very, very generous in my opinion. I would have been maybe a little bit less couth, Um,
Definitely.
If I were the one who was, but we have a great diverse steering committee in the Black Orchestral Network. So luckily we have folks
Sure.
to temper a little bit of the heat that I feel. But
Certainly.
I think it's doing that important work, and it's speaking, I think, quite honestly to what folks have been experiencing.
Sorry, I think I pieced together what it is that I was trying to say because of Lexi's incredible answer. So, because I'm always engulfed in our community, because I get to exit the predominantly white space that I've worked in for almost a decade, right? And then to look back at the percentage of about 2.1%, to see that as to see it quantified, it kills me inside. Because when you think about fellowships and you think about the people that inhabit these programs, they don't get the benefit of even being able to work with a mentor that looks like them. Maybe in a rare case. But when you think about the fact that only 2.1, and even that number may be skewed, when you think about that small percentage is what comprises the Black population of professional musicians who are trying to give back to their own community and pull the ladder up. Imagine what it would look like if there were even 20 Joe Conyers, you know what I mean? Scattered throughout the orchestral field. 20 Weston Sprats, 20 Titus Underwoods, 20 Emilio Carlos. You know what I mean? Like, what if we were given that access the way that so many of our colleagues boast that they studied with this incredible pedagogue who has this long lineage of teaching passed down to them. You know what I mean? So to see that small number, just it kind of minimizes for me all of the things that we do, because there's so many of us out here who are passionate about this work, who want to give back, who want to do that, and to see it quantified to such a small number, it almost it kills me inside. That's what I was trying to say.
No, it totally makes sense. And, you know, I appreciate you sharing it. There's something about the work, there's something about the journey that is increasingly or can be increasingly demoralizing, particularly when the experiences go unnoticed and unexpressed. And, there's something worth naming here directly. When you create a separate sort of lower paid, lower status designation, particularly for Black people or for people of color, inside an institution that, full members occupy equally. Of course, it has this historical name. It has already been named already, the first and last. And of course, we call it separate but equal. And, I think, Emilio, there's something about what you're experiencing that many of us have experienced that is a product of what that designation produces. It is demoralizing. It is designed to have fresh inspiration spurred by the idea of your favorite local orchestra having a diversity fellowship program, but not seeing meaningful difference. It is as wicked as the queen in Alice in Wonderland. We are running twice as fast to stay in the same place. And one might ask, why are you taking this, African American studies class? But, to answer that question is the same way I would answer, why is that song stuck in your head? There's research to suggest that, earworms are unresolved music, unresolved cadences that stay stuck in your conscious, and you keep thinking about it until you can remember the end of the song, and then it's resolved. I'm still taking the class because we're still having the problem, and it's still in the forefront of my mind. Emilio, I want to stay with you and keep going. There's this idea that we talk about frequently within this space, particularly in advocacy, right? The baby in the bathwater. There's something that works. There's something that we need, but there's a lot that needs to be purified or cleaned out. You've taken, Emilio, you've participated in more than one kind of fellowship program. I would love for you, if you can name those programs and talk about some of the meaningful differences between the two. What was different, and what does that tell us about what's actually possible?
Yeah, so I participated, as I mentioned previously, I was in the inaugural class of the Cincinnati Symphony's Diversity Fellowship Program. I participated in the Chautauqua Symphony Orchestra's Diversity Fellowship Program, which was like the Cincinnati Symphony and Chautauqua had a partnership where students within the Cincinnati Fellowship would be filtered into Chautauqua's fellowship for the summer. And then sometime after Chautauqua, I was in the New World Symphony in Miami Beach. Um, and even though I had pleasant experiences in all of them, I also had a more than fair share of unpleasant experiences. And in some ways, I almost preferred my time in New World, not necessarily because of the palm trees and the amazing weather and all the great memories that I have there. Um, but it was because I was treated like an equal because there wasn't this hierarchy. Like we came in as classes of sometimes 20 deep. You know what I mean? So amongst the two other classes that were ahead of you, there was never this sense of you are beneath me. Excuse me. Sure, there's competition. I'm competing with the same 12 violists in my section for whatever audition it is that comes up. But there was never this sense of you are beneath me. Like, I think in some cases, I won't name names specifically, but there was a time where in the middle of a rehearsal, somebody just like they look back at me as I'm warming up. And this is like I'm so serious about this. They look back at me unwarranted and they go, "You know you're not even considered a sub, right?"
Come on.
And I was like, "Bro, I came on this stage. I woke up, I put my socks on, my shoes on the same
Fam.
way that you did this morning.
Yeah.
We're literally here playing the same part. It's not even like your principal.
Yeah. What type of
And even
timing
if
are
you
you
were,
on?
what gives you the excuse to just project whatever insecurities you're feeling this morning onto me?
From
Because your morning coffee was lukewarm or didn't come out that great. You're just gonna turn around, not even a hey, good morning. You're not even a sub. You know what I mean? And then it goes even further, not that this particular instance has to do with diversity fellowships that I've participated in, but unfortunately, there are some musicians who will never see people that look like me as anything other than good enough to be in a diversity fellowship program. I was in the finals for 2 years back to back. I'm talking about toured with this ensemble, had the privilege of, putting that big name on my resume, made finals for a second year in a row to be in their section. And after the second time, somebody from the committee that the screen was down comes to me and says, I think you'd be a great fit for our diversity fellowship program. You should really apply. And in that moment, I'm like, Miss, I just made the finals in this national audition to be your colleague. And that's all you can see me as? You know what I mean? So in so many ways, I preferred my time in New World because of the camaraderie. You know what I mean? I feel like there are also some moments where people outside of the African diaspora feel as though we're given an easy path because we didn't have to audition for a 1 year position or we didn't have to audition to even be in the section. And essentially, why are we being given these opportunities and other people aren't? Um, and I feel that there lies so much of the problem. Like, again, I'm not going to name names, but when I got announced as a participant in the inaugural class for the Cincinnati Fellowship, somebody in my work study job, just like straight up, the day that it got announced was like, yeah, I'm so jealous, because you're black, you get to do this. And I've been auditioning for that orchestra for years. And I was like, that don't got nothing to do with me. You could say congratulations. You know what I mean?
That's an option.
Um,
Mm.
and I feel like what they don't realize is they can't separate the fact that they can go to a symphony orchestra, rehearsal, concert, whatever. and they can find infinite examples of representation for themselves, even down to the music that we're playing. You know what I mean? Wagner didn't have me in mind when he was writing Das Rheingold. He
At
didn't have
all.
some white people in mind
Yeah.
when he was writing Das Rheingold or whatever
Right.
opera it is. You know what I mean? But for me, in all of the 6 years that I was in the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music, to go to the orchestra and to only see one, count 'em, musician, Norman Johns, may God rest his soul, um, in that orchestra, and for that moment to have happened where they were just like, "I'm so jealous because you're Black, you get to do this," that takes away everything. The same way that when that person was like, "I think you'd be a great fit for the Diversity Fellowship Program," after making finals twice in this section, it takes away everything. And I was like, when are y'all gonna realize that we're just trying to gain accessibility to these meaningful opportunities that we have been fighting for centuries? Yet you have access to everything that you possibly want. Representation, reflection of your culture in the music. We don't get that. We get to experience that maybe once, twice a year. You know what I mean? If we're able to go to a Gateways or a Sphinx. So anyway, all of that to say, um, I really appreciated my time despite having a lot of very tense moments with management of the New World Symphony, uh, because my colleagues treated me like colleagues. I didn't have to prove to anyone that I deserved to be there. I didn't have to prove to anyone that I should be seen as your equal.
Yeah.
I came there and I was treated how I needed to be treated by my colleagues, and I'm saying that specifically. Uh, so I will rest my case with that answer.
Wow.
Yeah, and something just to respond to you, Emilio, because what you said is really powerful. I actually think that people really need to internalize the fact that we're in these spaces despite our blackness, not because of it.
That's true.
And like that's the end. We work, or not we, because I don't play, but worked your butt off, practice, did all the things, perform. You're an exceptional player.
Thank you.
And then of course, and then on top of that, you have also had to deal with racism. And if you're, God forbid, you're a black woman, then you also have to deal with sexism. God help you if you're queer or disabled or whatever. So they don't seem to understand that, like, in these spaces, blackness is a barrier to get over. Or I'll say this: anti-black racism is a barrier to get over, not our blackness. But it's positioned as a problem.
Lexi, you took the words out of my mouth because, there are issues here that are and will be human problems, right? You can go outside at a given day, um, and be wearing a shirt that says, like, I don't know, I love baseball, and someone can come to you and say, look, man, I really don't think you should be wearing that shirt around here. That is an affront to my personality and my feelings. That's a conflict, and that's something that can happen to anybody. The problem, I think, extends to what measures are in place to make sure their problem does not become my problem. Because your coffee was lukewarm this morning, and so you wanted to turn around and haul a racial epithet at me. There should be some sort of, either protective measure or sort of concerted anti-racist sort of practice or policy. And so where I want to lead us now as we begin to sort of wrap up this conversation is this idea of accountability. You know, Sometimes people hear accountability and they hear consequence. And many times that may need to be the recourse of action. But I'm wondering for you both what accountability looks like for, fellowships in these diversity oriented, fellowship programs and orchestras, and what does it mean in practice, right? Not just in HR libel, but what are some of the other things that can help curtail and change the culture of racism in orchestras?
Go for it.
Yeah. I mean, this is a tough one. I think some of these orchestras feel that by offering a diversity fellowship, they're opening a door, but they don't seem to realize that there's an obstacle course beyond the door. So I think part of what they need to do, they're not going to get rid of the obstacle course, because to frame it the way that they think about it, everyone goes through the obstacle course. But that course looks differently for minoritized folks in classical music. So finding ways to actually provide meaningful uh experiences that are not like wholeheartedly negative, I think is part of it. I think also we need to move beyond defensiveness as our initial gut reaction to some of these things. Like if you're hearing a critique, don't dismiss it, actually think about the ways that, perhaps you as an administrator, perhaps folks who are working with you, perhaps musicians that you've witnessed, or even if you haven't seen it, just take people's experiences at face value and think about, how you can create change in your institution. These orchestras, they have the opportunity and the power to not only create artistry for their audiences, but also to create camaraderie and meaningful music making and connections and collaborations and emotional investment that they don't seem to understand. So I think we should worry less about the bottom line, less about image, less about these sort of arbitrary things at this point, and think more about what are my musicians, what are our musicians experiencing, and how can we make it beautiful? And that's what it should be at the end of the day.
Wow, beautiful.
Yeah, beautifully said. The one thing that comes to my mind is in all of the fellowships that I have experienced, I can't even remember if somebody actually sat me down. And I'm not gonna, speak in absolutes here. Maybe they did on a separate occasion with another person who participated. But me specifically, I've never been asked, "Hey, can we like sit you down and talk about your experience and maybe see what worked and what didn't work, how we can expand upon, what you thought was great and maybe what needs to be revisited in the program." It's almost as if a group of people who are the gatekeepers and the decision makers with all of this access to the experiences that, a lot of my colleagues are trying to gain are saying, what I provided is good enough, even though the vast majority of my community is saying it's not. They're just like, well, make it enough. And you have to realize that you're dealing with a group of young professionals who are entering a space where the majority of administration and musicians combined do not reflect their background. So how could you possibly go about creating these programs and not try to seek consult from professionals who reflect their background, or them who are entering this space with a whole new set of experiences, musical abilities, musical ideas? You know what I mean? And I think people need to use their platform, their leverage, and their power to create changes for good, not just um, a dusting over of the same old model that is slowly being proven to not work in today's society. You know what I mean? There's a reason why so many orchestras are now taking to social media when, again, I'm not naming names, but there was only one orchestra at first that was doing the thing on Instagram really well. And then everybody was like, oh, man, that works. We should do that now. The same thing with diversity fellowship programs. Aside from my time in Cincinnati, I can maybe only count two other orchestras that had long-standing diversity fellowship programs. Everyone and their mother has a diversity fellowship program now. And what's it resulting in? That same percentage number, 2.1%. And maybe that's an exaggeration. Again, when you look at these European models, when they boast on their websites, 19% in this orchestra alone came from our academy. And you know what? I want to quickly shout out an example of someone who I think is doing exactly what needs to be done. in Owen Lee, principal basis of the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra. Not only are there two musicians, one of whom is now his stand partner in the Cincinnati Symphony bass section, they are now tenured. And on top of that, Owen is always giving opportunities to students who go through his program, whether it's in Chautauqua, be like, yo, come get this paycheck for the summer, come get this experience, or just subbing regularly in his section in the orchestra. You know what I mean? Like, that should be the example. This person understands the mission, is able to evenly distribute the wealth, not just to diversity fellowship participants, but people who come play for him on a regular. And it's like, there's enough space at the top. It doesn't need to be this rat race of, it's you versus me. And because you're Black, you're getting all these extra opportunities. No, you know what I mean? He's a clear example of how it can look. And it's a long game. It's not like it's going to be an immediate turnover. You know what I mean? But I've always thought that he's someone who's doing an excellent job to provide accessibility and opportunities that so many people have been looking for since they started this crazy journey of trying to be an orchestral musician. Man, I was on a rant. I forgot what the question even was.
Well, it's really this idea about accountability. And I think, that looks like a few different things. I think we're balancing the structure and the function. We're balancing individuals' morality. We're balancing good faith versus bad faith. And what that does require is an audit of language, an audit of social impact strategy, an audit of funding. And I think, aside from the structural sort of operations of it all, there need to be, brave truth tellers and advocates and ambassadors in this space that allow for sort of, continuity and integration of not only the people, but the history. There's this interesting idea that Black people or those who might have a sort of, diversity initiative supporting them are now getting an easy pass. The difference is we, a lot of times as Black people, think of our path as not starting on our birthday or our birth date, but our path being what my mother and grandmother and, fathers, uncles, what we went through then and what that means now. So there is not really an integration. There is not that sort of idea of, hey, this is really where we're coming from. And so the strategy is not emergent. The strategy is not responsive. And so I do think, shout out to Owen Lee, man, because to be in the space and say, hey, I want to invest in you, because an investment in you is an investment in all of us. I want to start to round out our time here. I'll throw it to you guys one more time before we wrap up. But, Bon has spent 4 years demonstrating that this language, this, revealing and uplifting of experience can become a standard, right? DAO2 showed up or evidence or led to the tenure model procedures and guidelines with the American Federation of Musicians, that being actual legally binding contracted language. So there's something about what we can do here. And I really want to impress that people should check out the letter, because there are so many different recommendations that Bon is calling for. And at the same time, they also fall into like maybe 3 or 4 categories. The first one is this idea of the Fellows' Bill of Rights, this idea of guaranteed standards across all programs, right? How do we regulate and standardize the pay and the performance time and the mentorship and the onboarding and the protections, right? Every program is different, and it's no man's land. It's the Wild West. The second thing I think is important too is thinking about funding. What does it mean to say, hey, we're applying for this grant and getting $50,000 for this fellowship program, but not really following through on a good faith model that is responsive and does hear the people that it's hurting and meant to serve. So beyond funding, I think also thinking about this idea of consortium funding, this idea that orchestras pool resources into a shared endowed fund. And, fellows are matched to orchestras based on the instrument needs, and smaller orchestras that can't afford their own program can get access, and fellows get properly funded and longer term support. One of the last things we talk about is this idea of fellowship to employment pipeline. That is the biggest thing, right? And one of the things we're concerned with through Black Orchestral Network is how do we get money in Black people's pockets, shout out to Titus because he talks about that a lot. The problem in one line is fellowship programs were never designed to actually hire people. They can be a facade and they cycle. Some get through, with dastardly odds against them. Many don't. And there are receipts that show over 40 years, the needle hasn't moved. So playtime is over. There's something that has to happen. I just want to give you guys one more, just one more chance to say your piece. And, if there was, I'll leave you with one of two questions to respond to. We can either go the direction of the prospective musician, or we can go to the direction of the admin, the board member, the funder. Thinking about those who want to engage with either applying for or supporting a fellowship program in 2026 right now, at a time where our government is rolling back these protective, interventions, what do you say to a prospective musician or board member looking to uplift or participate in or fund one of these orchestral diversity fellowships today?
Yeah, I am down to speak to the board member. I think it's a shame that, these administrators are not viewing these fellowship positions as actually valuable. Like what would it look like if you were to, at the end of a fellowship year, be able to announce, hey, our diversity fellow just landed a spot in the New York Phil or the Boston Symphony or LA, or even better, our diversity fellow is so spectacular. They're going to stay here with us and we get to benefit from their presence because they're valuable. So I think that would be such an incredible statement because also this administration is not y'all's friend. It's anti-intellectualism, it is anti-arts, it is anti anything that doesn't further the state's current projects. And I won't get into that because I could go on a whole 40-minute lecture. But so you should think about the ways that, instead of trying to appease these folks who maybe have a lot of resources, who maybe have a lot of capital, why not actually meaningfully value and respect and welcome in the folks that you have in your diversity programs? Because then also you are fostering an environment where people not only have the opportunity and the privilege to go to work and play music, but also to go to work and play music with people they respect and hopefully are friends with. How much more meaningful would your institution be if that was the status quo?
I
Emilio.
love that he addressed the board member because I really wanted to say my piece about the funder. Um, I think more organizations should follow in Mellon's steps, where they started pulling back, where it's like, if you're an organization that claims to uphold and value diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, or whatever the acronym has turned into today,
Mhm.
especially during this administration of, this time of such uncertainty, people need to start pulling back where it's like if you've had this program for X amount of years and not a single one of them has been able to, you know, gain some sort of permanent employment in your own ensemble, give the money to someone who's out here actually doing the work to benefit the community, not just perpetuating this cycle of a revolving door that just leads somebody in for a quick second and throws them out and you never really hear from them again. It's the same old song about these diversity fellowship programs. It's like I said before, everyone and their mother has a diversity fellowship program now. What's it resulting in? Somebody can just check a box and say, yeah, we uphold diversity, equity, and inclusion. Look at this program that we have.
Right.
Where are those musicians now? Are they still subbing with your orchestra? You know what I mean? Did they receive ample training while they were there? And I think a lot of funders need to look at the way that they're distributing funds because that's where the power lies. Money is power in this game.
100%.
And there's so many organizations out here doing the work for the right reasons, like Bond, like Gateways,
Mm-hmm.
where money in relation to the amounts that these ensembles are receiving, a portion of that could mean everything for smaller organizations that are out here trying to do the actual work.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, we've been doing a lot more with less.
Can I also say something to fellows?
Sure.
The I just want to, I don't mean to be bleak, but for those who are also applying for diversity fellowships or any type of fellowship, you as a Black person will likely have to exhibit extreme levels of tenacity. Just because of not only the nature of many fellowships, but also just this sort of period of time that we're in. Um, so I also encourage y'all to reach out to, like, if you're having these negative experiences, reach out to people who make you feel sane and whole and good and lean on them, especially if they're not within your field, because they can really sort of bring you back to reality. Um, so just lean on folks. And also, the Orchestral Network is here um, if you need anything.
Amazing.
That's facts. That's fact. And to piggyback off of that, I know we got to bounce, but yeah, for people who are considering applying for diversity fellowship programs, unfortunately, you will come to the realization that not everybody in the ensemble who is hosting you in that fellowship voted in favor for you to be there. So, like Lexi said, there are organizations out here like Bond who has your back in a lot of situations and are here to provide a safe space for you to vent, to be amongst professionals who have lived experience that can help guide you through very tense moments that may happen on the job. And just don't be afraid to shoot us a message on Instagram, shoot us an email, shoot me a message on Instagram, whatever. We're here for you, and we're more than happy to be a resource.
I appreciate you both. Dear American Orchestras 3 is available now at blackorchestralnetwork.org. Read it, share it, and if you're inside an orchestra, take it to your colleagues. I want to thank my guests today, Emilio, Carlo, and Dr. Lexi Ligon Holloway. Got to put the doctor in there. I'm David Norville. This is Black Music Scene. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next time.